In this video, we want to look at part 2 of solving quadratic equations. In the first video, we looked at factoring and extracting the square root. In this video, we're going to look at two more methods, completing the square and the quadratic formula. Now, completing the square is kind of what leads us to extracting the square root. And let me kind of show you what I mean by that. If we had x squared minus 8x plus 16 is 0, this could factor into x minus 4 times x minus 4, or x minus 4 squared, is 0. And once we have it in that form, we could do the extracting the square root. X minus 4 is 0, and I would just get x equals 4. Now let me mention, before we said, well, quadratics always have two answers. Well, this is really factoring into x minus 4, so we have two answers, 4 and 4. Now, if we had something like this, and I factored the left side into x minus 4 squared equals 9, I now have it in the form to do extracting the square root like we looked at in the last video. So when we do completing the square, what we're really doing is looking at a problem and trying to convert it into something where we can do extracting the square root. So we look at this. Now this factors into x minus 1, x minus 7. And so I get 1 and 7. But if you go back, you could see how if I subtracted the 9, I could make this look like this. They have the same answers. So what we want to do is we want to take something that looks like this and convert it into something like this to be able to extract the square root. In this case, it's not necessary. It factors. But what happens if we have one that doesn't factor? Now, to do this, we need to use something called a perfect square trinomial. And a perfect square trinomial is something like x squared minus 8x plus 16. That factors into x minus 4 squared. We need the same factors twice to do this. So if I have x squared plus 6x plus what gives me a perfect square trinomial that I can write like that. And what we want to do is, in this case, the number is 9. How we decide what goes there is we take half of the middle and we square it. Half of 6 is 3, squared is 9. And that number we took half of the middle, 3, is what goes here. So x squared minus 10x plus half the middle term, 5 squared, 25. Now in this case, because it's x minus 10, this would be minus 5 squared. Now here's kind of the opposite. This is 49, which you notice perfect square. 9, 3, 25, 5. So this is going to be 7. But what's that mean in the middle? Well, the square root of 49 is 7, so this is going to be 14. Those are the ideas of what a perfect square trinomial is. And we're going to use the fact we can write it like this to do extracting the square root. So let's look at x squared plus 6x plus 6 is 0. Our first step is going to be to group all the x's together and put the number without the x kind of on the outside of the parentheses. And I'm leaving some blanks on purpose as we do this. We're going to take half the middle term and square it, like we just talked about, and add that right there. Now, I have my plus 6 over here. Since I've added 9, I have to subtract 9 as to not change anything. So I have x plus 3 squared minus 3 is 0. Now I can do my extracting the square root. I can put 3, I can add 3 to both sides. Now I can take the square root, and I get x plus 3 is plus or minus the square root of 3. So my answer is negative 3 plus or minus square root of 3. Now, if we did this problem, you might say, well, I could do x squared minus 8x. I can pull the 7 out. This is I add 16. Therefore, I'm going to subtract 16. But you can see in this problem, you would never do this. The reason you would never do this is because the original factored. This factors. This works great when it doesn't factor, like this. Let's try another one. X squared plus 8x plus 4. So we group x squared plus 8x. Going to leave some space. Half the middle term is 4 squared is 16. Subtract 16. I get x plus 4 squared. This is going to be minus 12. I move it over, I get 12. Take the square root of both sides. X plus 4 is plus or minus square root of 12. So x is negative 4 plus or minus, and square root of 12 I can write as 2 square root of 3. And there is my solution. So the goal with completing the square is getting it to this step right here where we can do extracting the square root. Now, let's look at this one. This kicks it up a notch, makes it a little bit harder. What we're going to do is we're still going to group the x's together, but I have to factor out that number in front of the x squared. Because in order to do completing the square, I can only have a 1 here. So half of 4 squared is 4. I did this. Now, to decide what to add over here, I realize I took 2 times 4, which was 8. So I need to not add 8, excuse me. I need to subtract 8. So now I get 2x minus 2 squared minus 19. And I want to end up with just x minus 2 squared. So I subtract 19, divide by 2, and I can get to there. And once we get to that step, we can extract the square root, take the square root of both sides, and kind of jump to the end. I'd get 2 plus or minus square root of 19 halves, and we'll just leave it like that. Now, extracting the square root. We don't use it a lot. When we use it, it's important. But what we want to look at is the quadratic formula. I know you've seen the quadratic formula. You've used the quadratic formula before. I'm not going to go through it here. It's really, really cool if we did. If we completed the square with this, factored out the a, went through all the steps that we just did with completing the square. And if we do this, we will see how, lo and behold, it kind of just jumps out at us as we go through this, that we end up with the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula is something I kind of assume everybody remembers and is able to use because it can pop up at any point. Factoring always works. Always. Quadratic formula always works. Factoring doesn't. When factoring works, it's quick and easy. But if you only want to know one method, quadratic formula will always work. Factoring is the quickest and easiest, but doesn't always work. So let's look at an example. We want to find our A, our B, and our C. A is 2, B is 3, C is negative 4. So now we just plug it into our formula. Minus B plus or minus square root of B squared minus 4 A C. Put parentheses around these. Anything you sub in, put parentheses around it every time. It'll help you from making a mistake. So now minus 3 plus or minus, and let's see what we have here. This is 9. This would be 4, and 2 is 8, and 4 is 32, but it'd be plus 32 because there's a negative and a negative. So this would be the square root of 41. And we're just going to leave it like that. If you can simplify the radical, do it. But square root of 41 we cannot. And so there is our answer. Okay. I encourage you, write these down. The biggest mistakes I see people make are these right here. Where these negatives are here, they don't make it positive. Or if it's a -3, squaring a negative is a positive. All right. You are now ready for the rest of the homework worksheet on the quadratic formula for part 2, completing the square and the quadratic formula.